fantasy short stories. Of Portals and Portents by Lesley Herron. Chapter 32, Jasper. Several bloody and limp bodies lay scattered across the cobblestone path that led towards the tower. Mel stumbled over one and noticed they were all clad in black robes of varying degrees of extravagance. Some were little more than a burlap bag thrown over armor, while others had been extensively tailored, embellished with golden thread and jewels. But one thing they all had in common was that whatever had happened to them, it hadn't been kind. Beyond the bodies, the massive wooden doors to the tower sat slightly ajar. Vel pushed his way through, into an ornate foyer with wide arches reaching up into a vaulted ceiling, supported by dusty and wax-covered pillars. He allowed himself to collapse against one of them, struggling to catch his breath. He was in bad shape and quickly getting worse. The throb in his head was near constant, and it was causing his stomach to churn and his vision to darken at the edges. And the flashing warnings in his field of view weren't helping, despite diminishing slightly with the distance from the river and the disturbance.
Amy, I need a little help here. What are my options?
Aside from returning me to safe mode.
Obviously.
He rolled his eyes, but almost immediately regretted it as he was plunged into a strong wave of vertigo. He clamped a hand over his forehead, waiting for the nauseating feeling to pass.
Can't you, I don't know, reroute power to my limbs? Shut down maintenance protocols? Something.
What a splendid idea. I will shut down your internal organs. Humans don't need to breathe, right?
With a grunt, Vel began walking.
It was just an idea. No need to get snippy with me.
His arms and legs felt as powerful as ever, but every time she glitched, it sent a spasm of pain through him that caused him to stumble. If he could just make it to the top of the giant tower, all he'd have to do was stop his brother. An easy task, right? He let out a wry laugh. Yeah, easy, except Eric was supposedly a dark mage now and most likely insane and drunk on power. Vel glanced down. Among the layers of dust and cobwebs was a single line of blood that trailed away towards a faded runner and a large stone arch. Well, at least he had a way to track the man down. He attempted to swipe away another notification, but Amy resisted and pulled it right back up into his field of vision.
I know!
He dropped his hands, leaning against the wall for support. His voice was quiet as Vel finally found his words.
Amy, please. I just need...
What did he need? He wasn't afraid to die. Hell, he had been hoping for it for most of his life, ever since his brother cobbled them back together. Vel looked down at his mechanical hand. No, it had been even before that, ever since he was pulled away from his life and the people in it. There was his answer. He needed to finish this and make it back to the kids. They were his family now, and he knew what it was like to lose a loved one. He wouldn't put them through something like that.
I need you to pipe down and let me work. Do whatever you can in the background to keep me ticking. I trust you.
The warnings became more transparent, almost invisible, but Amy couldn't bring herself to let the warnings go entirely. Vel nodded his thanks. They would get through this, even if he had to punch the Grim Reaper right in his stupid, smiling face. An absurd idea, he thought, but it was enough to force Vel back into motion. He squinted at the carpet runner, struggling to follow the trail of blood. It pulled him through a dense hallway and stopped him right at the edge of a new room. The ceiling in here was even higher, and he glanced up.
Oh, crap!
Vel braced himself for the mother of all glitches. Above him, Staircases were moving of their own accord, twisting and hanging upside down or swinging left to right. There were red doors chasing after the staircases, or would zip off to relocate themselves on a different landing. Inverted, spiraling catwalks were doing their best to avoid the chaos as they crisscrossed the entire expanse of open space, going up as far as his eyes could see. He blinked and waited. And waited, but the spike of pain never happened. He lowered his hands.
Oh, you have got to be kidding me. A floating ball of fire is magic, but this...
Vel thrust his hand out toward the open expanse.
Isn't?
You are witnessing the visual result of warped space. The structures are not moving. Reality is moving around them.
Fine. Whatever.
As long as it didn't kill him outright, he would just pretend it wasn't happening. He looked down. The trail of blood droplets continued along a curve in the hallway. He had a sinking feeling they led into that chaos where the pathways were constantly shifting. He would have no way to follow them if the hallway suddenly changed, or the door he needed wasn't there. He groaned, dragging his mechanical hand down his face. If he got lost in here, he could very well spend eternity searching for a way out. Following the trail of droplets was his best option, but at the realization of the number of offshoot paths that he would have to check sent his blood boiling. A gentle chirp pulled Vel's attention back to the ground. Trotting up to him, its lengthy orange tail held high, was a cat. A pang of guilt shot through him when he remembered, in his haste to find the kids in Avis, he had failed to check in on his home. This one reminded him of his cat. It had the same golden eyes, and a white spot on his left paw, and...
Chum?
He bent down and scooped up the orange tabby, inspecting him. With a shaky laugh, he confirmed it was his cat. Save for a small singed patch of fur near the base of his tail, the animal was completely uninjured. It felt good to know his little friend was okay.
Ha! You scrappy thing.
He paused, his fingers absent-mindedly scratching Chum beneath his chin.
Wait, how did you get here?
Through the front door, obviously.
The craggy old voice echoed off the walls, filling the empty space between them. Vel's fingers froze. He frowned as he stared down at the cat. Chum was purring deeply, his front paws making biscuits in the air. He looked around, but the two of them were alone in the hallway.
You can talk.
Of course I can talk. I'm not a simpleton, you idiot.
Since when?
With a jolt, Vel held the cat out at arm's length, his eyes wide in confusion.
What do you mean since... By the gods, you're talking to the cat, aren't you?
There was a heavy sigh.
Over here.
Vel spun to see the true owner of the craggy voice. An ancient, stooped man was strolling out of a doorway that hadn't been there a moment before. He folded his thin arms behind his back and offered a disapproving scowl.
And here I thought your brother was the stupid one. Intelligence doesn't weigh too heavy on the branches of your family tree, I take it.
Vel exchanged hurried glances between his pet and that weazened old man, and his cheeks flushed with color. He set Chum down with a cough and straightened up.
Yeah, sorry. I didn't see you there. I was just surprised to see my cat.
Your cat?
The old man shot Chum an appraising look.
He's been here, mooching off my foolish generosity.
Sounds about right.
Vel looked up, meeting that disgruntled gaze with a hopeful lift of his brows.
You said you know my brother. Do you know where Eric is?
Wilfred leaned over, plucking the orange tabby off the ground to cradle him in his arms like a small baby. Between the tummy rubs and chin scritches, he jerked his head over his shoulder.
Of course. He is likely in the middle of completely ignoring me and endeavoring to alter reality.
His expression shifted to one of sour amusement.
Not that he'll succeed.
Vel's jaw tightened.
Can you point me in the right direction?
The old man chuckled.
If you promise to wallop him once for me, then I'll do you one better. Sit tight.
Wilfred turned back to the door he had stepped out of, which was emitting a freezing fog.
That's enough provisions for now, Bob. Come on out.
As a shambling, reeking corpse shuffled out of the room, his arms piled high with an assortment of frozen goodies, Vel couldn't bring himself to be surprised. Of course there were zombies. Why wouldn't there be? He was really starting to hate magic. Swinging shut the door, Wilfred tapped at the wooden surface with one of the many metal rings on his fingers. The bricks surrounding the frame began to rearrange themselves, shifting and spinning to swallow the door into the wall. They continued to pull into themselves until a gap opened up to reveal a dark and dusty corridor with a tall red door at its end. Gesturing down the new hallway, the old man stepped back.
You'll find your idiotic sibling in there. Hopefully this time around he's making the right choices, but I doubt it.
Wilfred shook his head sadly.
He never does.
Thank you.
Vel cupped his hand against his cat's head, letting him nuzzle into it.
Take care of Chum for me, okay?
Aha!
He spun on the zombie.
See? I told you he was a chum bucket and not a Kevin.
Vel watched the zombie let out a disgruntled moan and lift one of his shoulders in response. A chicken leg toppled from the piled banquet, catching the attention of his cat. He offered the two a sad smile, nodding at the old man before he turned his back on them and faced the darkened hallway. He started along the creaking wooden floorboards, and the wall behind him began to reassemble. He didn't bother to look back. He needed to focus on what was ahead. What was he going to find beyond this door? That question caused him to hesitate, his fingers floating inches above the handle. Would he even recognize his brother? Manic stubbornness ran in the family, and he was likely to find his sibling in a state of unattached mania. Could he be reasoned with? Vel licked his lips. If he couldn't, could he do what was necessary to stop him? A flash in his cybernetic vision warned him against waiting around. He had precious little time to waste and a worried little family to get back to. That rallying notion flooded his body, and Vel closed his fingers around the handle and pushed the door open.
Eric?
Walking across the surface of the river, Pyra rubbed at her throat, slowing her pace. Her gaze landed on the man that had once been her husband, still slamming his fists against the golden barrier, screaming with fury and rage, his audience inside having abandoned him. The last time she had tried to reach him, he hadn't even acknowledged her. How would she reason with him now?
If you reach him but can't change his mind, you'll need to make a choice. Either wallow in your sadness, pining for someone who's gone, or get up and do something.
Despite Vel's callous and rude behavior, he had a point. She could no longer stand aside, inactive, as the well-behaved wife. She had to do something. Elias! Pyra found the unexpected flood of courage almost a comfort, even if she wasn't sure where it had come from. But she didn't shy away from the terrifying visage as he turned, pausing his hammering to look in her direction. 2 sets of gnarled antlers had sprouted from the top of his skull, his long hair undone and tangled in the prongs. When he tilted his head, she could see a flash of recognition ignited in those purple eyes. As he began to stalk in her direction, his feet leaving smoking rings on the living bridge, Pyra knew that the thing moving towards her was no longer her husband. Although every nerve in her body was screaming at her to run, she held her ground. She closed her eyes for a long moment. "Father, give me strength." She clenched her fingers into fists to hide the quiver in her hands as Elias stopped right at the edge of the living bridge directly in front of her. "I wish to speak with my husband."
Ah, the dutiful wife.
A hard chill ripped up her spine as those words raked across Pyra's soul. Rivaria spoke with Elias's voice, but it echoed as something otherworldly in her mind. She stood no chance against the goddess, but if she could reach the king, if she could speak with the man inside... "My quarrel is not with you, Night Mother, but with my spouse." She swallowed hard. "He has many crimes to answer for, and I am here to make sure that he does." Rivaria tilted her borrowed head once more, taking in this brave and foolish Selkie woman standing before her on top of the roiling river like only her people could, as if being just out of reach could save her. The goddess took a step onto the water herself, the smoking rings around her feet causing the vines to follow her movements. With her wooden right hand, she brushed a finger down along the Selkie's cheek and offered a gentle smile. But it quickly evaporated as she cinched her hand around that slender neck once more. Pyra let out a tense gasp as the strong grip held her fast, but it was not crushing down on her this time. "Elias?" She refused to buckle, scrabble, or claw at that hand. She would not show fear. "I love you." An involuntary twitch of her fingers caused Rivaria to relinquish the Selkie, and she took several steps back, one of her borrowed feet slipping into the river. "He's still in there." Pyra seized the opportunity and lunged, clamping her fingers around the collar of her husband's shirt and pulled him down to her level. Their lips smashed together in what should have been a loving kiss as she poured whatever passion she had left for the king into that moment. When they had wed, it may have only been for strategic military purposes, but in the time she spent with him and their 50 years apart, she had come to realize she did indeed love him, even with all that had transpired in the last year. But tears began to leak from her eyes when she felt nothing in return. Exhaling a sad sigh as old memories floated to the surface of her mind, Rivaria put her mismatched hands on the Selkie's shoulders and pushed her out to arm's length.
"Love?"
She shook her head and glanced towards the glowing wall.
"I knew it once."
She placed her fingers against her lips, closing her eyes for a flicker of a moment.
"It's been a long time since I felt the touch of another, and I can feel the emotions you have for your king."
Tears clouded Pyra's vision, but it didn't prevent her from seeing the flash of purple in her husband's eyes. "Please, if you know what I feel, then return him to me." Rivaria stared into those shining golden eyes and sighed.
"I understand more than most the grief you feel inside you."
She paused, mulling the words around her tongue.
"But love is a false emotion, one that only rots in the end. It is a weapon used to manipulate and control."
She pulled her wet foot out from the water and stepped back under the coiled vines.
Consider this an act of kindness, because allowing you to believe otherwise is too cruel.
She moved her left hand to gently cup the sulky woman's face.
Your husband is dead. His mind is burned away, and his body belongs to me now.
A shudder of revulsion tore through her as Pyra's skin crawled at that touch. It was wrong. It felt twisted and backwards, like she was being embraced by a stranger. But the deity's words rocked her most of all. Her heart was breaking, shattering like glass in her chest.
For the gift you have given me.
Rivaria paused, pulling her hand away to touch at her lips once more.
And for what you once meant to my broken pot, I will spare your life.
She stepped back, her gaze flickering over to the looming shadow of the tower. In her fury, she had forgotten about the goal at hand. A way back. With a shove, she sent the sulky stumbling away.
But come for me again, and I won't hesitate to snap your neck.
Pyra had known trying to help her husband regain control of his body was a long shot, but that knowledge didn't stop her from collapsing to her knees on the water as the weight of her failure washed over her. Why hadn't she tried harder to stop him sooner? Perhaps if she had, things would never have gone this far. She clutched at her chest as she watched the goddess of the night march towards the infinite tower. She didn't want it to come to this, but Pyra hadn't come unprepared. She reached into the pocket of her jeans and pulled out a short length of rebar she had found on the beach.
Get up and do something about it.
She swallowed her fear and lunged at the goddess, slamming the weapon into the back of her neck. Rivaria stumbled forward, a surprised gurgle escaping her lips as something wet and warm flowed from her mouth. Pyra didn't wait for her to recover, and instead twisted her momentum. She grabbed her husband by his shirt and hauled him over the edge of the bridge, back out over open water, and shoved the living deity beneath the waves. "You might puppet his body!" Pyra remained topside, her knees magically pressed against the surface as she held her once husband beneath the water. Her face twisted in rage as she uttered, "But I am willing to bet that body is still mortal." The goddess thrashed about, unable to find purchase in the deep river. Pyra's broken arm screamed in agony, but she held tight. It was a gamble that she didn't expect to work, but she had told herself if she couldn't reach him, she would at least stop him, for the sake of her people. A flash of blue light ignited the darkness around her, reflecting off the churning surface of the river, and she turned her head towards the source. Back on the bridge, a portal had opened, and for a brief moment, she thought that Cyborg had returned for her. But her mouth fell open as she watched the prince leap through, sword in hand. "Varen!" In that flickering moment of distraction, Rivaria stopped struggling, bubbles escaping her mouth. She called forth more vines from the very depths of the riverbed and sent them crashing into the sulky like a battering ram. Pyra flew back, landing half on and half off the living bridge, the air knocked from her lungs. A cry of fury rent the air as Rivaria rose to the surface, elevated by a moving platform of twisting roots. Her blazing purple gaze scanned the darkened surroundings for the gnat that had tried to drown her. Varen rushed over to the queen, attempting to pull her fully onto the bridge, but stopped when he felt those violet eyes land on him. There was a look of murder on the inhuman face that once belonged to his brother. He leveled his sword, stepping over Pyra in her defense. Rivaria flung out a hand, calling forth another vine, and sent it screaming towards the prince like a javelin. With a flick of his sword, Herron deflected it to the side, flinching as it slammed into the river behind him and showering him with a fine mist. But another vine was already headed towards him, too fast for him to parry, this one aimed for his heart. But before he could react, something caught him around his waist, toppling him out of the way. He tripped over his own feet, and both he and the queen, cinched tight around his middle, tumbled backwards into the portal. Pressure clamped down on them from all sides, forcing waves of nausea to slam into them before quickly spitting them out onto a different patch of ground. Herron sucked in deep gasps of air as he looked up.
"See, Piper, I told you it wasn't going to melt the prince into a puddle of goo."
Pyra glanced around to see several familiar faces, the tiny dwarf and Barry mingling with new ones as they all stared down at her. She attempted to speak, but was still winded from the impact. She managed to lift a weak finger towards the swirling gateway. Piper, translating between the urgent gasps, shook her brother's shoulder.
"Close the portal already before that thing comes through."
"Oh, right." Atticus twisted one of the rings on the device, and the glowing blue vortex snapped out of existence. Allowing herself to succumb to her emotions, Pyra buried her face in her hands and sobbed. She didn't hear anything else the group had to say, not that she cared. Between body-racking wheezes, she wept for the loss of her husband and for what was to become of her people. After what felt like only a second, a strong hand gripped her shoulder, and Pyra managed to look up. The prince was kneeling in the grass, his eyes searching hers in question. Without a second thought, she threw her arms around him and sobbed like only a broken heart could against his neck. Shocked, Herron hesitated for a moment before he managed to close the embrace. Between her body-trembling wails, he processed what he had just seen. Vel had been right. Elias was gone, replaced by the goddess of the night. He would have given all the gold in his kingdom to just crumble into his own despair and remain in the muddy grass with the queen, the two of them crying until sleep took them. But they could not stay here. He borrowed some of that old cyborg's courage and pulled Pyra to her feet. Herron gave her one final squeeze of their comforting embrace before placing his lips against her ear and told her in the barest of whispers, "It'll be okay." The clack of mechanical keys filled the air like heavy rain on a tin roof as Eric's fingers flew across them. He was nearing the end of the alterations to the coding, to finalize a pathway to the past. Even he had to admit the solution was elegant and so obvious. He couldn't touch the Mirrorverse, and yet he had to travel through it. But if he could copy the science or magic that the tower implemented, warping space around him, he needn't actually touch anything to move through three-dimensional space. He'd be protected by an Alcubierre bubble as it warped space around him. Something that would have been near impossible back home. But here, where physics played captive to the fifth fundamental force of nature, it was more than possible. He would break through the barrier, enter into the bubble, use it to travel near light speed, and...
"Eric?"
His fingers froze in the air above the keyboard when he heard the familiar gravel of his brother's voice. Not now. He was almost done. A pained expression pulled at his face as he glanced over his shoulder to see Vel step out from a door he hadn't noticed. His brother was pale, sweaty, and was clinging to the wall for support.
Oh, hey, you look awful.
Vel snorted as he shuffled into the room.
I haven't seen you in 3 years, and that's the welcome I get?
3 years? Eric lifted his gaze to the ceiling. Oh, right. He shook his head, distracted.
Time dilation. You were moving faster for most of that.
He frowned and turned back to the computer, his eyes scanning the code for several seconds before he remembered what he had been typing and continued.
It's only been 18 months for me. Right. My mistake. Because that actually matters right now.
Vel cast aside that sliver of hope he had been holding on to. If Eric thought he looked awful, he was oblivious to his own state. He was filthy and disheveled. Deep bags of sleeplessness had settled under his eyes, and even his beloved, now tattered and threadbare Hawaiian shirt was buttoned incorrectly. It pained him to see his brother this way, and Vel forced himself to look around the room. Thousands of mirrors were piled in every corner. Many were cracked or shattered completely. Some had thin, wispy wires protruding from them. The walls were hidden behind dozens of blackboards, each one smeared with chalk dust or scribbled on with a shaky hand. Dozens of forgotten, empty or half-filled coffee mugs littered every available surface, and at the center of all the chaos sat Eric, manically typing at an ancient keyboard. It was attached to a computer that appeared to have been cobbled together with a myriad of parts that could span a century of technological change. But one component caught Vel's attention. Peering at him upside down was the familiar, dead black eyes of Berg. Not a similar machine, but Atticus's actual robotic friend that had been pulled through the portal when Elias fled Avis. Vel marched past his brother and straight for the machine.
Where the hell?
His fingers fell across the wires connected to components within the contraption's cranium. Anger bubbled to life as he turned to face his sibling once more.
Where did you get this?
Eric frowned at having to split his attention once more and refused to look up.
I don't know where it came from, but Elias had me hook it to that.
He paused, gesturing up to the floating rings of the Ophanum high above his computer.
To help process the computational load in order to expand the rift. But we made an error, a miscalculation. An error?
Disbelief pulled his lips into an unsure smile as Vel listened to his brother casually and calmly speak of the utter destruction of not just one world, but several.
Okay, skating right past the fact that you are working with a madman. What the actual hell are you doing here, Eric? Your error killed people. Hundreds of... I know.
Eric slammed his hands down on the table, pushing himself to his feet.
Of course I know. Far more than you do. What do you think I'm doing here?
He let out a snort of indignation.
You can't just show up here on your ivory horse with your self-righteousness and presume to know better. I'm trying to fix this.
His attention was pulled back to the screen, the siren's song calling to him once more.
I have to fix this. And I can. I can fix everything.
Vel closed his eyes as his heart sank. He had seen his brother in this state before and knew where it led.
Some things can't be fixed, and trying only makes it worse. Remember Dad? Remember what you did when he left?
He lifted his mechanical hand for emphasis. Eric waved the gesture off.
I haven't given up on him either. I'll add it to the list of things I can change when I go back.
He hunched over, squinting at the screen. He ran a finger across the monitor, attempting to find his place.
Suffice to say, If I've done my math right, I'm on the cusp of making a bridge to the past.
Vel offered his brother a bewildered look.
How is that an answer? Even if you managed to go back, which is impossible, by the way, it wouldn't help anyone here. You'd be making a new timeline, not fixing this one.
Eric glanced up for the briefest of moments, a slight smile tugging at his lips.
You read too many sci-fi novels.
He pointed at the chalkboard.
The future is a superposition of infinite possibilities, but the past is singular. Like a zipper on a coat pulling the wide future into a single line.
He began typing again.
I'll go back and prevent myself from causing this calamity, and this entire future will cease to exist. I can even go back and stop Dad from leaving. We'll never have left home in the first place.
Vel's face paled. Never left home? Never met Evan, or helped Piper find her brother. Never saved a nation from tyrannical rule, or had a birthday cake baked by Unit 2. It would all disappear.
No.
Excuse me? Vel began stalking forward, reaching for his brother.
I won't let you do it.
Whoa! Eric jumped up, dancing out of Vel's reach.
Why not? It'll fix everything. I can bring back all the people I killed. Fix? You're not bringing anyone back. You're erasing those that are left.
Vel lunged, catching his brother's shoulder, but Eric twisted free from his hold and dashed around the table, putting it between them.
But they won't know that. They won't exist. It'll be like none of this ever happened.
Vel's blood began to boil, and even the ghosts of Amy's warning lights brightened with rage.
People have lives here. Hard-earned ones.
He plucked up a cup and hurled it at his brother.
You can't just take it away from them because you don't like the way things turned out. It may be a crap reality we live in, but these are our lives, and you don't get to make the decision to take that away. You don't get it!
Eric raced around the table, keeping it between himself and the cyborg as he struggled to remain out of harm's way.
No, you don't understand. I ruined your life.
Holding up his hands, Eric's voice began to quiver as he dodged another coffee mug.
I took you away from home, from Mom. I can give that back to you.
He shuffled away as his brother plucked up another cup. In desperation, he added,
If you let me, I can get you back to Lucas.
The mug slipped from Vel's hand, shattering on the ground, echoing the sound that had just tore through his heart. We thank you for joining us for this chapter of the novel of Portals and Portents, Book 4 by Lesley Herron in this ongoing series available here on Tall Tale TV. You can find links in the description to where you can listen to all her books and novellas, with new chapters appearing as they are being written and recorded.
Listen, Gramps, Veron, are you sure you want to do this? I mean, I know Atticus says it's safe, but he doesn't exactly have the greatest track record with that word. He doesn't even know how this thing works. Of course I do, Piper. This thing is amazing. It uses a high-frequency resonance to produce a single versal interference pattern that accesses an interstitial secondary plane, warping three-dimensional space into a two-dimensional gateway. See? No idea. Was that even English? It makes a gateway that teleports you across distances rather than dimensions. How do you even know what it does? You've just been holding it for like 15 minutes. It's all in the instruction manual. See? What in the heck? These chicken scratches actually make sense to you? They look like they were written by a dyslexic ferret hopped up on caffeine and pixie sticks. Are these even letters? I mean, no, I can't read it. Not really. But I get the gist of it. The gist of it? For what it's worth, man,
I agree with Miss Priss on this one. All right, if you're sure, fire it up, Einstein.
This is gonna be awesome!
Good luck, amigo. You go get her. Now we just have to wait and see if he survives or if he turns into a pile of melted goo. Melted what?
Really bad track record.